Today I have the pleasure of talking to my good friend Abner Coimbre. Abner is an accomplished programmer, having worked at the NASA Kennedy Space Center for several years as an intern and getting the title Intern of the Year. He spent several years working on the compiler team for JAI at Thekla and worked at Cyan as a systems programmer working on build and other issues that team was facing. And he's also been a prolific organizer in the handmade community from the very beginning. He was the initial founder of the Handmade Network website before it was passed on to other leadership, and has been organizing independent conferences since 2019. And he has rapidly improved in both the size of the audience that he pulls and the quality of the events that he puts together over those several years he's been doing it already. Abner is a huge leader in the handmade community, and he brings a lot of people together in a lot of different ways, but a lot of the time he is playing the role of bringing people together and then stepping aside to let them speak their mind, to let them give a talk or to show what they've been working on, and very rarely do we get to hear Abner's own voice. That's sort of the role he plays. So I thought it would be interesting to hear what this project means to him, understand some things about why he does it, what sort of day-to-day looks like for an independent organizer who is kind of inventing the wheel for the first time in his particular domain. We talk about things like what does it take to organize the speakers and the job booth lists at a conference like the ones he puts together, and what does he do to keep ticket prices down while he's also avoiding taking sponsorships. This is a lot of work, and I'm really curious how Abner does it all and what, in fact, goes into it, because a lot of it is going on all year round, and we only see the results at the end, like for a few days at the end of the year. On top of that, we talk about some interesting stuff like the language ban that he introduced in 2022 and get some rationale behind why he did that and what he thinks about the outcome of that experiment. And finally, we get to hear about why Abner has decided to take Handmade beyond Handmade Seattle into his new initiative, Handmade Cities. I don't think there are many places where Abner explains in much detail the full scope of his vision for the handmade community, and I find it pretty interesting and pretty inspiring, and I hope you do too. Without further ado, here's Abner. All right, I'm here with Abner today. Hello, Abner.
Hey, hi, Alan. Thanks for having me here. Awesome.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I'm really excited because, we're going to talk to a lot of different people on the show about programming, but with you, I'm going to talk about organizing a conference. So it's a very different kind of thing you do than a lot of programmers. You also program day to day, but what I really want to do is pick your brain about what organizing a conference for programmers is like and why you do it, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get started with, I think, the fundamental question is why you do organize conferences as opposed to anything else you might spend your time on. And you do this full time now, so you put a lot into this project. And I think the first sort of version of this question that might be interesting to think about or to hear your answer to is, what drew you to this particular project in the first place? Like, how did you decide that this was the thing you would take on?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, as you said, these days I'm a full-time organizer, and it's a specific flavor of that. So it's a full-time indie organizer. And I think, from a programmer's perspective, because I used to be a programmer, moving away from programming to being an organizer is definitely a paradigm shift. And it's like you're switching dimensions almost because of like the kind of problems you solve day to day. So yeah, I run indie conferences for tech events, and it was weird how I got there. And maybe we should explain though, like what an organizer does when it comes to this, because organizers, you can imagine that if your majority of your audience is a software engineer, let's say, which I think is a fair bet, they would have gone to a tech conference at some point. And there's all kinds of tech conferences, for all kinds of different themes. Mm-hmm. You have game development conference, GDC is a really famous one. You have Microsoft X Fest or Sony E3 or you name it, Bang Bang Con and Strange Loop, and for hackers and for networking, like all kinds of conferences. Mm-hmm. And if you're an organizer and you want to put together a conference like this, your job is to solve problems in two major themes. And I think in our conversation, we're always going to be bouncing back and forth between these two themes. And it might be worth explaining that.
Yeah. I'd be interested to hear what the two themes are. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have theme number one, which is solving for unbounded social problems. And imagine you're putting together a conference. That means you got to find, for example, a venue, a building, probably a giant building, in order to fit together all the people that are going to come to your conference, right? Who do you find that can give you access to a gigantic building in a major city? Because that's where I run my conferences, right? It's in major cities. Who do you find to get access to those buildings for multiple days? Who trusts you with that, right? So that's a whole category of people you have to talk to, for example. But once you do, let's say you do manage to get the building, you got to staff that place, don't you? And there's a whole diversity of staff that you need too. It's not like just one kind of staff. You have the security guards are part of that staff. You have the catering, the cooks. If you're going to have food available for people, you have the audio video people who are like technicians and stuff like that. You might have IT people in case you're dealing with like internet problems, and you have the janitors. You have all kinds. It's a whole diverse staff. You got to talk to them too, don't you? Because you're the organizer. And the problems just keep mounting when it comes to social interactions. Because then you got to talk about the actual audience, the people who are going to buy your tickets. That's also a whole plethora of people with different desires for what they want out of the conference. And your job as the organizer is like you're like this super connector that allows this flow of people to coordinate together and agree upon your purpose for why you're putting the conference in the first place. Mm-hmm. And again, there's all kinds of interesting sub problems that comes from trying to solve that seemingly unbounded social problem. That's theme number one, mm-hmm. right? Okay. Then you have theme number two, which is a problem that I think many small business owners will deal with, which is like, how do you find the capital? And specifically for organizers, it's how do you find the upfront capital? Because we don't have to talk about like how you hire staff, because that seems pretty obvious. You got to pay them, and they're not good. I'm sure you have a volunteer or two, but for the most part, all of these people that are working together for this event, it's a huge time commitment. They're going to want to be paid, and you got to have that capital for them. But it's all, so that's kind of obvious, but maybe I'll talk about the venue specifically because that's an interesting one. If you're an organizer, you're also dealing with other organizers, especially for corporate events. That's the industry right now is dominated by corporations putting together events. So you're competing against the organizer for the Sony stuff and the organizer for the Nintendo stuff and E3 stuff and whatever. And what they do is they say, I want the best venue in this city with the best rates and the hottest dates where people will travel, to that city and do stuff. So they reserve the venue usually a year ahead of time, and they lock it in, which means I have to compete with that to some degree. And I have to reserve with, again, upfront capital, huge sums of money, a deposit for that venue to push away the other competitors and lock in one of the best venues, one of the best dates for people to travel. And I'm not even going to make that money back until I can sell tickets like 6 months later or, something like that, right? So theme number two is like upfront capital problem. And you're always dealing between these two themes. And if you're a successful organizer or a competent organizer, you're solving all these sub problems from these themes all the time. And you're solving them for the most part successfully.
Yeah.
Cool. So we're getting close to why I do this full time. Why I decided to do this full time. So with these themes, most organizers, the status quo is that, for theme number one, the organizer is usually like the social butterfly person, which I don't think there are that many programmers who are social butterflies. I happen to really love human interactions in addition to computer programming. So that partially answers your question of why I think I can do it or I want to do it, because I'm a social butterfly as well as a programmer. And if I'm stuck in a 9-to-5 job just interacting with the machine, I kind of don't want to be stuck there all the time, because I feel like there's a part of me that's not being expressed.
Right.
And that part of me not being expressed is like the social stuff. And it turns out that if you're a programmer and you're putting together a conference for other programmers, you got to be a social person, which I am, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's part of why I do it, like a personal reason. But the other reason is that back to the upfront capital theme specifically, this is a huge cost. Like the table stakes to start a conference, you need, like I said, the upfront capital. What most organizers do, they solve this problem through sponsors. Mm-hmm. And sponsors are usually companies in tech that want to be part of your conference, and they'll give you free bags of money. And free is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Maybe we can talk about that later. But they'll give you free bags of money so that you can pay for the cost of putting together this giant event. And then in return, you give the company brand awareness, which is, massive logos, posters, like Nintendo sponsored our conference, and all of this stuff. And they're like, they get to seem like the good Samaritan because they sponsored you for free and they gave you all this money. And then for the most part, you solve that problem that way. I have decided when I said I'm an indie organizer, is that I put together the same events that these people put together, and every year help to make them bigger and bigger, but without sponsors. And I think we're at a critical stage in our industry where if we don't put together events without sponsors, we risk a huge decline in standards that we're already seeing. But it's just going to precipitously increase. Decline in standards, both ethical and technical. And I felt that the way there's this corporate capture of how events are organized through sponsors, and we could talk about that, why I think sponsors are a bad idea. I think that we should do them in an indie way. There should be conferences out there that are 100% indie in order to fight this decline of standards. And again, what contributes to this decline is the status quo of almost all tech conferences being sponsored by companies and oftentimes corporations.
Gotcha. Okay, so what I'm hearing, and you make sure that I haven't interpreted any of this wrong, but there's sort of two big answers you've given us. The first is, at the personal level, it suits you very well to have something that lets you express these social sort of skills that you possess and want to do something with. And it also is on this other side, it's an opportunity to have some impact is what I guess I'm mostly hearing, like the status quo can be changed and that's something you want to do. Is that fair to say?
I like that. Thank you for that summary. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's definitely a compelling reason to get started on working on conferences. And I think I was going to follow up with the question, why is it independent in particular? But I think you've already, the independence is a part of the mission statement you just gave. I think another aspect of it being independent that's interesting to consider is, as you said, you're not taking sponsorships. So that raises the question, like, how much does that mean is on the burden of ticket prices? How do you avoid making, if you look at some conferences, and I tried to do some of the conferences are actually somewhat hard to research how much a ticket costs, but I've heard people say that attending GDC can cost upwards of $1,000 or more. Some conferences have online tracks that are a few $100s these days, just online tracks, right? And, if you try to look at like how to go to CPPCon, for instance, the only thing you can find publicly is that you can buy these large, like send 10 people, send 20 people for a few, a few grand for each step up there. And so they're charging quite a bit and they've got sponsors. How are you going to entice anyone to come to a conference without the sponsors to help pay for it? It seems crazy. You think it's a solvable problem?
I would say it is, and I have solved it to a reasonable degree so far. Although we got to be careful because it's only been about a year that I've been doing this full time, and but so far so good. Let's say it's looking optimistic. I would say first here, it's one of the things you can do if you're running a conference is independently. I mean, without sponsors, is figure out a way to cut costs and. But without sacrificing the quality of the conference that much, right? Because like if you're saving costs here everywhere, then it's not like you want people to go to a tent to listen to the speakers. Like you want something to feel nice, and like people who have gone to Handmade Seattle, for example, which is the conference that people know me for, Handmade Seattle. They know that it's in a fancy building. It's in the Seattle Center, and we have all the latest AV equipment and all that. So I am paying for it, right? How do I do it without sponsors? So one of the things is, remember that I'm a programmer, and a lot of what I do is figure out how I can automate work and self-host technology so that I can avoid paying a lot of costs that you would otherwise pay. One of those is, for example, Ticketmaster. And many conferences and concerts, events, whatever, they'll go to something like Ticketmaster. That's not the only one. There's like eventbrite.com and like these other services that will, it's like an event organizer platform. So they will solve the problem of like selling tickets for you, for example, and they'll solve the problem of marketing for you, for example, and all of that stuff. And they'll do that with like at a hefty cut of your ticket sale though. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine that if I sell my ticket at $100 and I use Ticketmaster, this is just a ballpark, but like let's say they might take like $10 out of that ticket sale. Like you Alan, buy a ticket for my conference, $100. I did it through Ticketmaster. They're the middleman, and they'll slice 10% out of that, right? And that's not counting like maybe PayPal fees or Stripe fees if you're using that for some stuff. And I said, why don't I just like I'm a programmer. I'm going to write my own Ticketmaster alternative, which I did, right? I have my own Ticketmaster alternative, and I sidestep that issue entirely. And instead of getting like $90, I'm getting back 98, for example. And that's a huge return on investment because it's not just 98 from Alan. It's $98 that I get from hundreds of people, if not thousands over the years. That's a lot of money saved that can go back into the business. So that's just one example of like knowledge is power, where if you can automate, and it's the same thing, like I know organizers who hire lots of people to help them put together such a costly event, not just for like the venue stuff, but like the tech infrastructure and the payment system and the merchandise and all of that stuff. I can automate a lot of that on my own, a lot of these systems on my own, because I am a programmer, and I've been able to, all of the workflows that would require multiple people, I can just do it on my own, right? That's not always true. I still do hire help, for example, but it's like a fraction of what a typical organizer will probably hire for, and that results in savings. And another reason that this works for me is that I have no problem negotiating down prices with. So this is one of the sub problems in the theme of unbounded social problems, right? There's this new sub problem that's introduced if you're an indie organizer specifically, which is the erratic salesman problem. when you get on the phone and you talk to, so I don't mean to offend, but like a boomer salesman, person on the phone to like rent a venue or to ask for insurance to insure your event, because you have to pay for insurance too, right? Or hiring whatever, like staff and all of that stuff. For the most part, people assume that you're going to pay whatever they ask you for, especially if you're like a corporate event. You can just pay whatever to make the problem go away. I don't have that luxury because I'm indie. But it turns out that this is all human interactions, and humans can be swayed and persuaded or charmed into lowering their rates, or into figuring out payment plans with you, or other kinds of things, like maybe they get a share of the profits at the end of the people that attended. So like there's all these shenanigans that I engage in with all different kinds of salesmen who are erratic themselves, right? These are people that want their bag as you're putting together the event, but I can kind of like do this dance with them to say, hey, wouldn't it be good for your brand? You know, imagine the Seattle Center, for example, that you are fostering this independent little guy organizer who's like reaching his American dream with like running a small business, like there's no sponsors. Isn't it also a breath of fresh air, right? That I'm doing something like this. Like, can't you help me? Can't you lend me a hand? Right? So I'm not saying it's not expensive. I'm still got to pay a lot of money, but the game has changed, right? I have reframed the problem into, these are human interactions, and I can persuade and sway people in ways that I guess other organizers with sponsors don't have to go through this trouble. But I go ahead and go through the trouble, and I can make it work.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the ticket prices for Handmade Seattle aren't private, and obviously we don't know what the 2023 prices are yet, if I remember correctly. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but they've never been that high, especially compared to a lot of those other conferences where they already have sponsors. So it's like you said, it's still early days, but it does seem like you're making it work somehow, and it sounds to me like, in addition to the two themes you gave, this idea that you've automated away things using your programming skills is not a insignificant portion of the work you put into the conferences. Yeah, that's really interesting. The amount of the amount of sort of elbow grease that actually goes into it, I think is invisible to a lot of people because you only come to a conference for 2 or 3 days, and that's the entire event. And certainly it looks like it's a lot of work while that's happening. And you can imagine getting together 10 speakers and some booths could take, a couple months of emailing and stuff. But what you've described sounds like a full-time job at the very least, if not more. So I think it would be interesting to understand a little bit more about what that day-to-day is like how much of your time is going into that automation stuff. And, you've also got to figure out how to run a matrix every year because you host your own and stuff like that. And you've got to do the social theme thing you're talking about. So like if there's a pie chart there, how big are each of these themes in your day-to-day work of running the conference?
That's an excellent example you said with Matrix, which is this also self-hosted. We talk about how I self-host a lot of stuff, right? So you have this chat server that is a Matrix server that is self-hosted on my servers. And I went through the trouble of integrating that with, for example, the ticket sales. If you buy a ticket, then what happens is, and we can explain like how that works, because then that'll explain how my programming workflow looks like, which is part of my day, right? So like if you buy a ticket, and again, it's not Ticketmaster, it's just my own thing. What happens is Stripe or PayPal will generate what's called a webhook event. And from first principles, a webhook event is just a HTTP post request, which encodes a JSON blob that gets pinged to your server. So my server receives the fact that, Stripe said, "Oh, Alan bought a ticket," and I get this JSON blob and I deserialize it. I got to verify the security headers to make sure that it's not a fake purchase or a duplicate event. So I got to deduplicate that too. So there's this idea of like idempotency design on your databases so that this ticket sales are not duplicated, or like if they're lost, like how do you plug that hole in if there was a network glitch? All of that stuff I have to handle, for example. And then I say, okay, my Matrix server will be gated based on who bought a ticket, because then if you want to get a chat invite into the server once the event happens, my system figures out in the database, these are the records, right? Like here's Alan, he bought a ticket, he deserves a chat invite. So generate that chat invite. And then you got to create an account. And there is this custom system where you get this page, you get this fancy email like, hey, you bought a ticket, so time to join the chat server. And then you put in your credentials in this fancy web page and you create your account and then you join. All of that is in-house. And it's this system that is just replacing something like Ticketmaster with my own custom stuff. Now, obviously, if I'm maintaining a huge database and I'm maintaining this chat server and I'm maintaining this payment like recording system and all of that, there's some maintenance work that goes into that. There's some improvement work that goes into that because I want that to work better each year. And I want to add to it each year. So, for example, if a speaker very originally, like in the first Handmade Seattle, which was in 2019, which was very bare bones. I did barely any automation at that time, right? Very manual. Then a lot of what I did with the speakers was like, hey, let's just agree that you're going to give this talk. Here's the topic. Let's work through it. And there was no chat server. It's like, we got to do it all in person. We had like this list of names that people will go and say, give me your driver's license, I guess. Let's see if I have you on this paper list or something. So it was like, oh, very manual. But now fast forward to today, and the speaker gets like this fancy email invite that says like, hey, go ahead and look at this agreement, this Handmade Seattle agreement that you're going to be a speaker and you're going to be paid this much and you're going to sign the form and agree to it. And then you're going to get paid like this, and like this is the date for it. And then like an automatic payment flow happens. So I hope you get my point that as the years go by, the onboarding experience for speakers, but also the onboarding experience for the audience itself should improve over the years, right? It should seem as fancy as the other conferences that have a lot of the corporate backing and employees to already make it all fancy looking from the very beginning. But I am iteratively, year by year, making that fanciness happen, again, on my own, without that sponsor money. So I hope that gives you a picture of part of my day, which is just like this workflow thing for the actual conference experience, mostly for the speakers, but also for the audience as well.
Yeah. I think that that does start to give me a picture of it. I think another part of what I can't picture about how running a conference goes day to day is the other thing that you sort of mentioned in there, which is talking to speakers and agreeing on what you're going to talk about. And obviously that matters a lot, because if you don't have speakers, you don't have a conference. But also you want to make sure you don't end up with a bunch of people giving the exact same topic over and over again. There's a certain amount of work that you must be putting into making sure you have an interesting variety of topics and a certain level of quality or attention being put into those talks. And, I mean, I can say from personal experience, since I have given one talk in person and one online, that between you and me, it was not a whole lot of back and forth. But I don't know if that it's the same for everybody, or if it's like, what does the process of that look like? Is it super individualized for each talk? What is the story there? And on top of that, this is sort of a part B to this question: how much of it do you feel like you are sort of orchestrating things coming together in a particular way, and how much of it is sort of out of your hands, and the speakers are kind of going to do whatever they do, and you don't really know what your conference is going to be about? Like, it's something I've wondered about as I've been thinking about what I want to know about how this goes, is how much of a talk is usually Abner and how much of it is the speaker.
Yeah, it's funny because part of that is kind of the secret sauce for an organizer. It's how are the topics put together? How do the speakers come together to have this, let's call it maybe a narrative that plays through as the event happens? And how much of that am I involved? And how much do I do like laissez faire, right? Like step back. And that is part of the magic sauce, because if you know how to balance that correctly, then you have a successful conference or not, like that the audience enjoyed or not, right? And the answer is this goes back to theme number one. And like, I'm going to repeat these themes a lot, right? So this is an unbounded social problem, because it's not predictable how I'm going to deal on a per speaker basis. So for example, you mentioned that with you, I didn't deal day to day all the time about your talk when you came to to the conference, right? Like, it was, part of that is we have an implied trust. You and I are friends for many years, and that helps a lot. And you also, at least for the Handmade conferences, you have been a member, let's say, right, quote unquote member of the Handmade community, also from the early days. And you created a really popular software that was used in the Handmade Hero series. So like, you have all this lore also attached to you, and that makes you a special case, because I do have this trust, and an organizer needs that. An organizer needs to also know when to trust and when to step back, right? To trust and step back. And I feel that way about you, for example. It's like, well, I might, and I think I mentioned to you, like, I have one or two ideas where I think you could give a talk on, but for the most part, you have a greater autonomy than perhaps other speakers do. So there are other speakers I work with where I say, I actually am interested in, for example, there's this famous talk, and I would encourage your audience to maybe check it out if they haven't yet. It's called Context is Everything. And it is one of the most popular talks, like easily top 5 favorite talks from the Handmade universe, let's say. And it's where Andreas basically breaks down a JSON parsing problem that improves in performance by orders of magnitude each time he does like a small change to it, right? All the way from like simple changes at the decision tree of like, are you going to use this library or not? Or like, are you going to update this library or not? All the way up to SIMD hammers, right? So it's a really fascinating, very core Handmade talk. And I remember like he had this mantra that low-level thinking translates to high-level wins. That was the mantra that he's had for many years. He was a demo senior originally. And I said, can we do a talk that explains why you think low-level thinking translates to high-level wins? What does that mean? Why do you think that is? Can you give me examples? And I want you to give a talk about that, right? And we went back and forth on it. He started preparing the talk. I get to see his slides early on. And I start to give comments about, well, this slide, you're using a Perl script. And so sometimes it seems like dumb minutia of stuff. But I'm just trying to give you an example. Sometimes I do get into the weeds. It's like, how about go with a Python script instead here? Or this slide, maybe avoid this. Or no, you can curse here if you want to. right? Cursing is allowed here and like whatever. So I am moderating both sometimes like the tone and like how much cursing you can do and like how the code is presented and like all of this stuff and like how bounded you are in the theme that I wanted you to give, right? So that starts to become more involved than I think you experienced when you were giving your talk, for example, right? Very often I give a lot of control and I almost never hear from them until it's almost time for the conference, right? But also by the same token, very often I am quite involved. And I don't even want to use the word trust here. It's more like how much do I think my input will be valuable to get the themes up and running the way that I want them to.
Right. You could imagine if it was all just invite a person, let me know when you're done, you'd get some very chaotic thing. And there does tend to be, a sense that there's some curation going on. If not entirely, it's not literally Abner is just giving us 4 hours of lectures for 2 days. It's clearly other people's perspectives and things from their experiences. But there's also, a very good blend of like that talk from Andreas is a super hardcore, the SIMD hammer, but there's also some philosophical talks and you get a good mix of them. So that can't possibly be by accident. There must be some amount of control you exert just to make sure you get that nice blend. It's kind of the way I was trying to understand it. That also sounds like a big chunk of the day-to-day then would be taken up by checking other people's ideas for a talk and sending feedback.
And sometimes it's not even that I'm nagging these speakers, so I don't want to scare away speakers who want to come to my conference, because I hope you feel that you will be trusted, right? If we're already talking, you will be trusted. I will give my input in things that are more aesthetic, about theme, about don't derail too hard on this particular subtopic of your topic, and I can nudge you on this other direction, that kind of thing. But you're still trusted, right? But there are days where I don't, harass speakers at all, right? But during that time, I am doing other things, and so we've talked about the programming workflow. We talked about curating the topics with the speakers, and not just speakers, but like presenters for demos, because we have, as you know, we have trade show as well, like demo booths, and we also have a job fair, by the way. So also this is also we made it where I wanted to go, which is like the idea of a job fair, at least for last year, was my first ever job fair, and that was also very time consuming, because you have actual companies that are trusting their brand with you, and they're not even sponsoring me, which is an interesting discussion, where many companies that come to a job fair would like to also sponsor the event, not just be confined to a table to hire, in our case, like the handmade people in our handmade conferences, right? But that's what I say when I'm looking for a job booth. It's like, you're a company, I want you to come hire handmade people, and I'd like you, if pretty please, just be confined to this table. Just like rent a table at a fixed rate. Every company will rent the table at the same fixed rate, and you're confined to that table just to hire people, and you cannot influence nor sponsor the event in any way. That was a hard proposition it turns out. And it turns out this was one of those pesky social problems, right? Where it's like, I remember talking to this one corporation. I don't want to give names, I'm sorry, but trust me, it's a real story. Just like the giant corporation, I'm like, can you guys come to the conference? But like, again, remember, just like rent the table. It's like, no, we'd love to sponsor you, Abner. Like, we'd love to kind of like have a bigger footprint on how the event is organized. And I was like, well, we can't do that, right? Because that defeats the mission and all of that stuff. So that was also very time consuming, just like weeks on end, navigating departments of HR and corporations, like who to talk to, who has the vetting or the power to grant resources for them to come to the conference and rent a table. Very often I would talk to somebody from HR, who would then talk to an engineering manager, who would then talk to a VP sometimes, right? Or even the CEO or CTO, usually CTO, right? Who then goes all the way up the chain, which takes a while, and it takes building relationships with these people too, by the way, for them to trust you. And the CTO then comes back down with the offer of like, well, let's also sponsor you. I don't want to just have the very small role in the company. And I noticed that pattern. I definitely spent a lot of time on that, and like how to break away from that pattern. Like, how can I actually get a company to say yes, right? And so learning that process, how to get them to say yes, was also time consuming. But I did eventually, right? Because we had, as you know, 7 companies actually attend the job fair. One of them, Mozilla, We had Mozilla. We had the creators of Astroneer, like this massively popular, I think, online 3D space exploration game. Like we have all these companies that again trusted us with the Handmade conference, and they did attend. But so that was also time consuming. This year is once again time consuming. A little easier, of course, because now there's more trust between, and there's like a whisper network of gossip of like, okay, Abner did a pretty good job at treating us nice. So now I am getting a lot more access when it comes to the job fair. But I also, that means I'm also meeting a lot more people for the job fair, and then deciding which ones I should have, and all of that stuff. So that's also another time consuming. Let's add that to the chart of like what I'm doing, right?
Right. I mean, if I could step in there for a second, I want to appreciate how you mentioned earlier that the social theme was one of the two big themes, and then the independent version of being an organizer. Any organizer is going to have to do the social stuff, but because you're independent, you added, well, we're going to have to reduce prices by sort of talking with the salesman in more detail and trying to get a better deal. And now it sounds like there's another aspect, which is anytime you interact with the corporation for a job booth, they have a totally different expectation than what you're bringing to them. And you have to interact with them for, multiple rounds just to get them to agree to put a table up instead of like what they're used to doing. And it's not necessarily, I doubt that any of the companies we're talking to you were necessarily doing it because they thought they could corrupt you or something. Is just outside of their norm too, right? So it's time consuming just to get through that so that you can establish, here's what it would be like for a job booth to run at an indie conference, right?
Isn't it fascinating how it does violate some intuition, doesn't it? Even the fact that you would think a corporation would have no trouble renting a table just for a job booth. It sounds normal. Mm-hmm. It sounds like it would be normal because they're getting access. That's what I'm selling technically. This is like a virtuous cycle. I'm selling access to these companies, to this huge handmade audience of like talented systems programmers to get hired, right? So I would call this a virtuous cycle because I rent it out, which means that's more revenue for my business. They get access to this audience. They get to hire good people. And then the people getting hired are going to get good paychecks, right? So you would think this sounds like it wouldn't violate intuition, but it does. It is outside the norms. It is expected for the most part. As far as I could tell, they want influence beyond just renting a job booth. And this even gets to power laws and dynamics of why should I have this one independent organizer have power over this corporation to just confine them, again, to that one table. So I'm not saying that every single corporation thinks this way or everybody that I talk to thinks this way, but some of them certainly do. They are uncomfortable with this power dynamic where I get to say, all you do and you have this massive presence, you're a corporation, but I only want you in here in this tiny little spot. Good boy, behave. So many of them are not going to have that. And I get that. But that's my mission, though. My mission is to, if I'm going to have corporations or companies join this conference, it has to be under the terms of you're only going to come hire handmade people, nothing else.
Right. And I think there's another element to the virtuous cycle you were just talking about, which is I think one concern you could imagine with an indie conference is that there might be a lot to learn if it's your niche, and you might get to meet cool people who are also sort of in your niche. But it sounds like it's not going to be the networking opportunity that like a GDC is going to be, because you're not going to have, just tons and tons of access to, all these corporations with job placement. So trying to get a job booth system running at all is addressing that concern. It sounds like, and it's sort of an uphill battle, but you're, without compromising that indiness, finding a way to still connect people to jobs in the way you would want at any tech conference.
And I would have to give praise to the actual handmade community and the companies and the software products that have come out of the handmade community, because those are the things that I can present to these companies as worthwhile. For example, I can tell a company, hey, I know I'm only confining you to this one job booth, but look at the products these handmade people are building, right? Like look at Jenga FX, look at EmberGen. Look at this, real-time volumetric software that's used for video games and film. And it's like this really small binary at the end of the day. I think it's like 20 megabytes or less or something, but it gives you huge bang for the buck, right? You can integrate smokes and fire and all of that into your game. And it's just this handmade product. And it's like, handmade people did this. Wouldn't you want to hire people like that? Mm-hmm. So, and this goes back to the virtuous cycle where it's not, what use am I if I'm exerting all of my social energy and skills to put together this grand orchestration of an event, but then there's nothing to show. So very often I am as much dependent on the Handmade people to care about their craft of building quality software as they hopefully depend on me as me building this marketing engine such that they can reap the benefits of that marketing engine as well. So I just wanted to make that aside just to
Yeah, no, that does make sense.
I do have one more comment about this though. Even though I don't have the same idea, like these huge sponsored trade shows at the conference where people can have like very easy opportunity for networking because you have all these brand deals and like, again, Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft sponsoring the conference, so their presence is huge, right? And it's felt, and then you feel like you have a lot of access to that. That a lot of that actually does go on the ground in our indie conference. So what happens is, number one, you do have the job fair, of course, but that's a very one-to-one transaction more than networking, right? It's more like, I want to get hired, and I want to hire you. And I hope that, here's my resume, I hope that works out. Please hire me, right? So that's kind of like the interaction, which feels different than just like normal networking experience. But it's not like it went away though with my conferences. It's just that it went underground. And what I mean by that is that I know for a fact many people attend the conference who are part of a big tech company, who are themselves organizers, who are themselves HR, who are themselves part of what you would call like the networking branch of these companies, the networking arm. But that doesn't mean you have to put more effort into finding who these people are. And if you want to get hired by them or like start a new opportunity or something like that. But I have heard stories of people either getting hired, again, privately, just by meeting the person next to them. Or I have met people who have started their own companies or gotten a contract, and like all of these generating like spontaneous connections that has happened, even though I haven't explicitly allowed anything sponsored to be visible, right? It just kind of went underground. I just think it's an interesting observation.
So the fact that you're indie hasn't really barred anyone, including bigger tech corporations, from being involved. You've just prevented them from having, any say in the organizing of the event. Right. Okay, so I think we've talked quite a bit about your day-to-day, and I've got a pretty good picture of why it takes, a full-time amount of work to put together a conference. And, there's a lot more we could say about what that process is like, but I think we've covered it pretty thoroughly. So I want to zero in on a really interesting sort of aspect of your conference that emerged in 2022, which was your language ban. And I wanted to understand a little bit about why that happened, because I think that was very surprising to a lot of people who might not have understood where that came from. And I think, after the 2022 conference, you even said that you thought it went well. And so it seems like there's something there that's interesting. I guess the first place to sort of visit in this space is, what is the language ban? What does it mean in practice?
Absolutely. It's interesting. The language ban means that I don't allow in our conferences any talk or presentation or demo with the explicit promotion of the adoption of a new language, specifically a new programming language. So, for example, we had talks, we had the creator of the D programming language, Walter Bright, great friend still, hopefully, who attended, this is the year before the ban, right? Who attended Handmade Seattle and gave a talk about import C, which is a feature that he implemented into the D language. And the talk was just about that, which was promoting the D language in that sense. And I also had a talk from the creator of the Rock language, who also gave a talk. And we've had the creator of Zig, we've been friendly, and the creator of Odin. He has also appeared at the conference multiple times. So we've been friendly towards language designers, for example. But with the ban, Walter Bright will not be able to give that talk again. So in a very practical sense, that is what it would mean. And you're correct that it was controversial. and that was quite a month for me. So there was this, there were conflicting signals of how people felt about it that I had to struggle to disentangle. And the first few signals was like, oh my God, like how could you, right? Because your conference is supposed to be for systems programmers and software engineers who are into low-level stuff, and language choice plays a huge role in that. Like you can't just like chuck it out the window, right? And that's exactly what you just did. And so I definitely had a lot of pushback on the Discords, which I'm sure you saw some of those explosions, and also on emails, obviously, and Twitter and everything else. So that was a huge negative signal. But there was this other signal of I think the month that I did that ban, I got the most ticket sales, the highest spike in ticket sales in Handmade conference history, at least since I started running them, right? So it was like I tapped into this undiscovered niche, I think I would say, that I think my language ban alerted them to this type of conference that wouldn't allow that the languages. For example, I did hear this complaint from the people who did buy tickets like excitedly, right? Again, there was this non-trivial number of people who bought tickets because of the language ban, because they were excited about it, right? So people that maybe we haven't really met in our circles, right? Who said, look, every time I think about a systems conference, I'm thinking about CPPCon, PyCon, right? CPP North, you name it. All of these languages, all of these conferences, low-level conferences oriented around a single language. And they were kind of getting tired of that. And even if there was a conference that didn't have CPP on its name, a lot of the talks were really just about promoting a language. And they were getting tired of being preached upon, right? About like this textual language that will replace C++ for you will save your life, or will change your life, right? And like they were getting tired of that preachiness. And I think that's why I got this huge spike in ticket sales, because these people, again, undiscovered market of people who were hoping to go to a systems conference without the language wars, without the language jockeying, right? And so that was very interesting. I'll stop there. I don't know if you have further questions on it, but
I have a few. That opens up a can of worms. It's super interesting. So I'd love to spend a little more time on this part. But yeah, I can appreciate that the initial backlash was definitely controversial, and I think it was also just surprising because, it's like you said, it's a low-level systems programming conference, and I think it's kind of understood that you can't do any of that without programming. So like programming languages. So what's left? It sort of almost boggles the mind to think you're going to talk about systems programming without programming languages from a certain point of view. But of course, I don't think that it literally means you don't talk about programming languages. If we actually look at what you did in 2022, there was a lot of, you had Bob Nystrom who's talking about language implementation, and the book Crafting Interpreters is all about his own language. And
exactly.
There are a number of other people talking about VMs that also have their own languages attached. And it doesn't really seem like in practice the language ban meant we don't talk about the tool we use as programmers. It sounded more like, and tell me what you think of this, it's more like an advertisement ban. No talk is going to be an advertisement anymore. What do you think of that?
I would accept that nuance to it. Yes, I would accept it, that it's a ban on advertising a programming language. You're correct about that. And if you want to know, like, I guess how it came about doing the ban, right? Because we talked about the effects of it. We talked about how people reacted to it in our circles negatively, but then I also talked about like this huge spike in ticket sales, which was interesting. But like, why did I come to the language ban decision? Would you like to hear my?
Definitely. I would like to hear that, and I have a follow-up question on top of that, and then I think I'll have covered this well. But yeah, let's hear about where did this idea come from?
Yeah, well, it's me doing social butterfly things and picking up on social trends is part of it. And the other part, because like there's another theme that you're going to notice maybe in our conversation, is that there's always multiple reasons for doing one thing as an organizer. It's not just like this one predictable reason. So one reason is I was picking up on social trends. There was this messed up incentives with social media. And GitHub sponsorships and status that came from being a language designer. And again, I don't want to name names because I'm not trying to like shame the people who did try to start a new language. But what's happening is you have figures in our communities, our programming communities, that love a language like Zig, for example, or Rust. But Zig is a great example. Odin is another great example. These are languages that are rising up, maybe not to replace C and C++, although I think very often it is for that purpose. And at least many people see it that way. Like these languages came up in order for me to replace C and C++. And as we know, there are actual deficiencies with C and C++. I'm not gonna, reject that fact.
Yeah. I mean, just to frame this in a different way, the year before this was the second time there was a audio only aspect of the conference called the Race to Replace C and C++ with a panel of language designers. So you were watching that cultural trend up close, and it was part of the conference the year before.
Well said. Thank you. Exactly. And I was noticing that trend. It's like, okay, this is interesting. But what I also saw was this influx, last year, this influx of proposals for talks for the conference, for my conference. And many of them were just about, here is my alternative to Zig, or my alternative to Odin. And it was just another textual language that has some ergonomic and syntax differentials and targets LLVM. And I was like, well, let me see if there's kind of like some advancing of the computing ecosystem. You know what I'm saying? Like, is there some kind of innovative language design technique that would massively improve your day-to-day workflow as a programmer? Like, is there something inspiring about that? It's like, I was not finding it, or it was like very little. So I was seeing this influx, again, this spike of language designers that wanted to steal mind share from the Zig audience, the Odin audience, the Handmade audience, to say, oh, forget about Zig, forget about Odin, like come to me, right? And I have this GitHub sponsorship page, and I have my Twitter account, and I kind of like seeing this transformation into like, I want to be a personality figure, a leadership figure around this language and the ecosystem that comes around it. Like, I want to be the next Andrew Kelly. I want to be the next Ginger Bill. I want to be the next Rust, which I don't want my conference to be a boxing ring for language designers to battle it out and steal mindshare from my audience. There's plenty of conferences, again, that have a language in their name that you could go to for that, right? Like, I'm sure, Odin Con will eventually be a thing, and good for them if Odin Con becomes a thing, right? And then I'm sure if you're a language designer, you can spin up your own conference, or go to a conference that is specifically about languages, right? But mine should not be about being a boxing ring to steal mind share, only for the express purpose of status, right? And maybe these people are going to get offended because they think, oh, that's not why I did it. That's not why I started a language. I actually think there is something valuable in this language, right? But it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to see what's happening in your actions, right? All I'm saying is that you're always talking about your GitHub sponsorship. You're talking like Andrew Kelly almost. Like the things you're saying and the things you're talking about are like mirroring the personality figures that you admire. And this is why you said in this last conference with the language band, I definitely had speakers who did somehow mention languages in some way, right? Like Bob Nystrom, we were literally talking about how you can craft your own interpreter, your own compiler, write your own thing. And that's talking about implementing languages to some degree, because you need to have a language design in order to make that interpreter work, right? But there's a whole difference between, I want to advertise my language to steal mindshare from people and do a boxing fight and have the status fight that I feel satisfied by being part of this little clique, right? There's a huge difference from that to what I tried to present this year with the band, right? So I picked up on that trend. I'm not saying it was like rampant, but it was definitely spiking. And I've grown up as, again, a social butterfly that notices like the inflection point of that spike and how it happened and when it happened, all of that stuff, and the zeitgeist in the environment and everything. I knew that it was time for a band.
Gotcha. So that's where the idea came from, is observing this spike, and you tried it out, And like I said, at the end of the 2022 conference, you also said that you thought it was successful in the sense that you liked the results. The conference went on well. So, just a year before, I think there were at least 2 or maybe 3 slots, depending on how you count them, that were about programming languages. And then now you've opened those slots up. So I think a question is it just more of the is that vacancy from not talking about competing programming languages filled by anything in particular that you envision as a more useful conversation, or is it just more of whatever other stuff, SIMD Hammer talks or something, but it's like more space for the stuff that's valuable? Like, which of those 2 mindsets do you have about, with that gone, what have you opened up space for in your mind?
It opened up spaces for 2 new categories that I hope they get fleshed out over the coming years. So one of the categories is more philosophical, and which you alluded to not earlier in our conversation. So the philosophical. There's this one talk, again, I could recommend it. It's called Complexity: Why Can't We Make Simple Software? By Peter Van Hardenberg, who is an independent researcher in this awesome lab called Ink and Switch, right? And he talked about, hey, yeah, why is software getting bloated and more complex as the years go by, as the teams grow, and like what's going on? Can we tame it? Can we tame complexity? Like, is this an inevitable property of the nature of building software, right? And he sets out to answer that question, in his wisdom and his experience. And that was one of the categories that I want to open up for Handmade. Not just the SIMD Hammer low-level stuff, but also just like philosophical questions of like, yeah, why is software getting bloated like this? Or maybe even like stuff like memory safety is an interesting concept, even though like memory safety can obviously get very low level based on the techniques that you implement with it. But there's a higher level philosophical thing of like, how safe should a language be, or how much should you constrain a programmer, put him in a straitjacket, right? With all these very difficult compiler safety checks that you have to satisfy with like the borrow checker. Like, how much is that worth in the name of safety versus aren't there problems out there that are naturally unsafe, and for you to get around the borrow checker, you're making everything worse, right? Like I'm sure there's huge debates on this topic, but it can often get philosophical, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's worth having that discussion as well. So that's part of it. Another thing that came out was this idea of becoming more than just a programmer. And you can see that in my life, Alan. You can see that I have not only become a programmer, professionally over the many years, and I do have this history of a love of computers and a love of programming. Like my first literal internship was with NASA, right? I went to Kennedy Space Center. I was very lucky for that. I did an internship there, and I worked hard on it. It's like I love programming for sure, and like if you allow me the humble brag, right? I got intern of the year at that time, and I got offered a full-time job there, and then I went to work for Jonathan Blow for several years, and then I went to work for the company that makes the Myst games, right? And I helped ship the Myst remake. So I've been very lucky and I've had a very fulfilling career as a programmer. But then I noticed this declining of I said at the beginning, of ethical standards, of technical standards in the industry on the whole, and that needs more than just programming skills to solve, right? And I thought, okay, being a social butterfly, being like a organizer, businessman person and salesman person, like that needs to be part of my curriculum, part of my portfolio, part of my developer muscles in order to make an even bigger impact in the industry. And I strongly believe that, right? And I would love it if the audience also feels that way to some degree too. Right? Anybody, it doesn't have to be, I'm not saying like if you're a programmer and you have a 9-to-5 job, for a fan company and you're happy, look, good for you, man, go get your bag. But maybe there's people in the audience who don't know that they have it in them to be more than just a programmer. Maybe they could be an entrepreneur. They can ship their own software, making a living off of that, right? Or they can start a business and employ people and make their own quality software. And that'd be amazing to have more independent software shops making quality software for the user. But you're gonna need more than just programming to make that happen. So that's the new category I have added that have been freed up from the language. Thanks to the language ban, we've had this the slots have freed up where I can maybe insert a talk. Boom. Like, how can you start your own handmade business? How can you do that? And we did. So we did this one talk that is one of the favorites, by the way. As far as I could tell, one of the favorites. It's called "It's Not Survivorship Bias" by Mason Romali. And he talks about, hey, I'm an indie handmade game developer, and I think I can make a living selling games, selling puzzle games specifically. And here's my method, right? And he explained the techniques that he's using beyond programming in order to make it as an indie developer with the handmade ideals, right? And that was a very interesting talk. And these are new avenues that I've been able to explore and think about after thanks to the language ban. And,
Yeah, that's, I think, a pretty compelling case for, the decision. And I'm interested to see if people who didn't initially understand the reasons behind it might warm up to it. Because I do think when we look at it up close, there's a lot of language conversation happening, and
all the time.
Just the idea of making some room for other conversations, to me, and given the two categories you just talked about, those definitely sound like a valuable trade-off. We're just talking about 3 slots at your conference. The world will still have enough room for language conversation, I think. Yeah, so I think I'm satisfied with what you've had to say about that. There's one last topic I'd like to get to, which is a little bit about what you're doing with Handmade moving forward. So as of 2023, there's this new initiative, Handmade Cities, that you're starting. And before the next Handmade Seattle, you're actually running this new event called Handmade Boston. So I was wondering if we could just get started by having you tell me a little bit about what that's about. Why are we expanding to Boston with the handmade thing? And what is there something going on at Boston that is worth sort of introducing to the audience that's different from what you've done before, to frame the conversation about this new Handmade Cities thing?
I'm so glad you asked. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about Handmade Cities, because it is what I am dedicating my life's career to at this point, right? So Handmade Cities is a natural expansion from the one conference I've been doing so far, Handmade Seattle, right? And this is great because I think I mentioned a couple of times that I'm seeing this decline. I'm growing concerned on this decline of ethical and technical standards in the tech industry, right? And I think that a huge cause of that is because our events, our ability to organize ourselves into conversations, into conferences, are controlled by sponsors. And this is why I think it should be sponsor free. So we reject sponsorship deals because I think we should be allowed to criticize the software of anybody. And what happens is when somebody accepts free bags of money, free, it's not really free. That's a core philosophy of mine. Nothing is ever free. And I think many people believe this. So a free sponsorship is not free. So if Nintendo comes to you or Sony comes to you, let's go with Microsoft. I think this is a great one because a lot of handmade people have a lot of beef against Microsoft for good reasons. So Microsoft comes and say, hey, or Amazon comes and they're like, hey, Abner, I want to sponsor your conference. Here's what happens. If I have a speaker that wants to criticize Microsoft software, wants to challenge Microsoft software, or even challenge their practices of data mining and invasive telemetry and adware and bloated and increasing bugs with every update, and like, what's going on? Why is my software crashing that didn't crash before? And like, I hate these updates. Why are you forcing updates on me? Or you're resetting my settings for my own operating system with each new update, and like, I'm not in control of my computer, and increasingly you are taking over things and you're not even protecting my privacy. Like, what's going on, right? So it's not even just about the quality of the software. It's just like the practices done through that software that are declining. And again, it's close to like my ethical concerns. And I have a speaker who's like fired up about that, right? Maybe they want to give a talk of like, I am going to list just all of the violations of user trust that Windows has perpetrated against me. I'm just going to catalog them. And that's my talk, right? Like, my talk is just going to be that. But by the way, we're sponsored by Microsoft because Abner said yes to a Microsoft sponsorship deal, which they gave me a free bag of 20K. And that's not too far off of a number, by the way. These sponsorship deals range in the 5 figures easily, right? 10K, 20K, 30K, right? Of quote unquote free, right? And then Microsoft says, "Hey, Abner, we took a look at this talk that you're gonna allow at your conference, and we're kind of worried about it, right?" And even if I didn't sign a contract, Alan, and I'm bound this social problem, right? Even if I didn't sign a contract with Microsoft, there is an issue here, because if I have become dependent on their money, and now my business model relies on the fact that I'm going to get sponsorship deals like the one from Microsoft, right? And they tell me that they're concerned about this talk about Windows, violating user trust. What is going to be my incentive? Is my incentive going to be to risk losing that free bag of 20K next year? Or is my incentive more like, hey, can we maybe change the title? I would tell my speaker, could we maybe change the title of the talk? Or hey, could we maybe preface because I do have the power, right, as an organizer. I could say, could we preface the talk by saying, there's lots of good people at Microsoft, there's lots of talented people at Microsoft. There's nothing inherently bad about or ill intention about what's happened. This is just my personal experience on things. Like I might ask them to contextualize it to the point of it losing its emphasis and its impact on the audience, right? And that's what I mean by that accepting free bags of money destroys our ability to change the industry, right? So I want to sponsor free tech events because a lot of what's happening is the decline of ethical standards in how we build software, the decline of how we've abandoned the user's quality of experience, we've abandoned agency over their software, we've abandoned their privacy. All of that stuff is at the hands of corporations because they have incentives that don't align with the incentives of the end user day to day, right? And if those are the companies that sponsor almost all of the tech events, they're going to control the conversation. And I have actual evidence of, when you're an organizer, you're dropped into this whisper network of other organizers. So I get to talk to them all the time, right? And they say, well, Abner, you're dumb for not accepting sponsorship deals, right? Because they almost always leave you alone. You're losing out a lot of money on the table. You're making your heart way more difficult than it should be, all of that stuff, right? But then I hear their stories of like, well, I switched the title of this talk, or I kind of guided this speaker to talk about this other topic that's kind of more interesting for the audience anyway, because I know that the sponsor wasn't happy about that original topic anyway. So, you can hear that like regular banter as if it's not a big deal that they're switching topics, here and there, or changing the title of talks. That's literally controlling the conversation at the hands of corporations, right? So you can hear that I'm passionate about this because I am, and I think we definitely need more events that aren't subject to those dynamics. So sponsor free tech events is a big deal, but it can't just be the one conference though. If it's just like the one conference in Seattle, it's not going to make the impact that it needs to trigger a paradigm shift in the industry, to change the conversation about how bad software is actually getting, and to freely talk about it, and to freely criticize anybody who's making bad decisions about the way we build software, right? So we need more than one conference. And Handmade Cities is that initiative to expand beyond just Seattle, which is where I live, right? And we're now expanding to Boston, which is the East Coast. So, I think this interview is, airing right now in 2023, a few months before the first Handmade Boston. And we have an obligation to expand because we have an obligation to send out a message that we have an obligation to software quality. We have an obligation to users. And the more conferences we have about this, the more people are gathering from all parts of the globe, because it's not going to just be Boston. I'm going to start with Boston to see how that goes, right? This is like I'm masterminding an initiative that's going to take many, many years to complete, right? That's why I am calling it my life's work in that way. And I hope that people, believe in me. I hope they trust me, and I hope I'm doing a good job so far. I know I'm human and I make mistakes, but I want this to happen, right? And it wouldn't just be for Boston. In the future, it would be for other places too. It would be something like France, right? Like I speak French too. And, il reste du vocabulaire à apprendre. Mais on peut en fait dire que je parle français assez bien. Pas de problème, ne t'inquiète pas. And I also, my native language is Spanish, so yo hablo español también. Podemos hacer un evento en Puerto Rico, por ejemplo, y podemos expandir no solamente en inglés, pero también en otro lenguaje fácilmente.
I wanted to add a note here while I was editing. So this is happening outside of the original podcast conversation. But Abner here is building up to a point, which is that he is able to speak these languages, which means he can connect with people in other countries who will speak a different language besides English natively and more comfortably. And so what he's demonstrating by speaking these languages in public appearances is that he's someone that they can work with. And so I wanted to help him make that point by having him translate what he's saying so that us English listeners, or those of us who don't know French or Spanish at least, understand what exactly it is he's saying to folks of those speaking those other languages when he does that. So in French, he said, "There's still more vocabulary to learn, but one can really say I speak French rather well. There's not a problem there, nothing to worry about." And then in Spanish, he said, "So I speak Spanish too. We can host a handmade event in Puerto Rico, for example. We can expand not only using English, but through other languages easily as well." So I'm going to let him continue on building up to that point. I just wanted to give you the full context of the full point he's saying there.
And I am also learning a fourth language. So I am a polyglot. Fourth language is coming up. I don't want to say it until I actually am proficient, like intermediate plus or something like that. I'm getting there. So I am passionate about, it's not like I'm going to be able to organize every single conference that's going to like come out of Handmade Cities, right? But the fact that I show that I care, right? That I can talk from somebody that believes in the mission in Paris, right? Or in Montreal or something. And they know that I'm speaking their language because I want the presence there to matter. And if I show them that I care about this by speaking their native language, that's a huge emotional connection. That's a social butterfly thing that I think matters. So I'm sorry, Alan. I'm so passionate about this that I feel like I haven't even answered the Boston question specifically. But for Boston specifically, the idea for Boston is Seattle is a celebration. That's what I call it. It's like the biggest celebration of systems programming. And that's where we have inspiring new talks and trade shows and job fairs and demo booths and social hangouts of all kinds. And that's not going to change. I'm going to keep organizing Seattle. But then Boston becomes like this mentorship conference. And the idea of a mentorship conference is that our speakers are going to become instructors. And the audience are going to become almost like students in the university, right? And the idea is that instructors will give a seminar to teach a subject that they love. Like one of our instructors for this year is Kaze Emmanuel. And for those who don't know, Kaze is, oh my God, he's a legend among the Nintendo 64 modding community. Mm-hmm. And he has optimized the performance of like Mario 64 so that it runs like, locked at 60 FPS or something like that. And he's made his own level editors for it in 3D. He's made his own online mod for Super Mario 64 where people literally play online Mario 64 games using the original ROM. He made a DLC for Ocarina of Time by literally downloading a patch that you can edit into the original ROM so you can play this new game. Right? And legend has it that he just edits hex code in Notepad day to day. So like, you think Handmade is low level? I think I told Kaze like, hey, we're into C and x86 assembly. It's like, right? He just like goes, go do it. I edit hex code in Notepad to like make my DLCs for Ocarina of Time. So it's like, oh, interesting. So can somebody like that give us some new skills to learn as programmers? Because there's a lot to learn there, because he's not only updating old ROMs that would drive older systems, he's modifying them, he's upgrading them, he's preserving them. That's an amazing skill that we could have as programmers, like this skill of preserving old software, upgrading old software, maintaining old software. That's a great skill, for example. Wouldn't it be great to have Kaze as a mentor, right? So that's the idea. So Kaze is going to give like a definitive guide to modding in N64, but hopefully that skill transfers to anything you want to do in terms of modding and preserving old software. He teaches us that. And like a seminar, you can imagine a seminar for a couple of hours. He's like a university professor. We're learning at his feet. And then he'll give us take-home exercises. He's literally designing exercises for us to then complete, and he'll give us official support. So we're going to have like a forums website that I'm self-hosting a private forum. So if you buy a ticket, I'm self-hosting a forums. You get invited to this private forums and you get to do the private take-home exercises with Kaze supporting you every step of the way until you finish those exercises. And the hope is that some of these audience members do form some connection with Kaze, and Kaze feels a connection with them. And then this mentor-apprenticeship relationship takes off, right? And he's just like one example of that. It's going to be more instructors, obviously. And for those who go to the website, to handmadecities.com, you can start seeing those instructors coming up, right? And so this is, as you can see, the flavor of this is far different from the Seattle flavor. Mm-hmm. It's more about, I want to spontaneously generate mentorships if possible by making this environment of like the speaker's an instructor, the audience members are willing student, and they work together, and hopefully something happens. Hopefully they become mentor-apprentice relationships beyond the confines of the conference. So this is a core idea of Handmade Cities, that not only am I expanding beyond Seattle to do different handmade conferences, but each conference is special in its own way. They deliver content in a different way from the other one, and they bring something different to the table. So you can either want to attend all of them because it's like, very exciting, or you can just choose the one that you think would match your interests more. Because maybe you're like, no, I'm a programmer already. I'm a senior guy, right? I'm going to retire in 10 years. I don't need a mentor. So I'm just going to go to Seattle and celebrate with all of you guys, right? And something like that. Or you could be something, no, I'm young. I'm a junior programmer. I'm a college student. I am so in love with Kaze's work, right? I hope he can become my mentor. So I'm going to go to Boston, right? Or you can be somebody that loves both, right? And then you go to both. So that's kind of like the idea of Handmade Cities, and I hope that my passionate rant there made some sense of some kind.
Yeah, I think it definitely did. The big takeaway I have is that the Handmade Cities initiative doesn't just mean you want to run 2 conferences now, and so that the name Handmade Seattle stopped working. Handmade Cities sounds like a much bigger project than just that. It's sort of, it's your passion definitely comes through for that. And then looking at specifically what you had to say about Boston and the idea of having different formats at different locations, I think you've given a little bit of guidance there, but I'd like to stay on that topic for another minute and kind of dig into that, because I can imagine being someone who's looking at coming to the U.S. from across the globe and trying to think where do I sort in here, or a student, as you said, who could see themselves sorting in either category. And you've given some idea of what the format is like, but there's also certain sort of tensions here where at one level, there's no question that I want to be at all of them, because it's the more to learn, more people to meet, it's always going to be great. If someone has to choose, then I could imagine them trying to figure out, okay, is this Handmade Boston sort of more basic? Is it more beginner oriented? Because you're talking about students. Is it better if I'm more in a beginner level to go to this conference? Or is it really actually quite advanced, and I would be better off as a beginner going to Handmade Seattle, where I'm going to absorb things, and this is not just you're a student, but you're supposed to be ready to go at really advanced topics and hit the ground running. I could imagine that, what you just described with Kaze does not sound like something a beginner is going to be able to handle by just showing up and be like, okay, teacher, what are we doing today? So it sort of sounds like both, and I'm wondering what do you think if you had to give advice to someone who can only make it to one? Let's think of a couple different sort of indicators of what might help you make that decision. So the first one I brought up, I think, is maybe the one that's the most obviously difficult to resolve, is if I don't know if I'm ready to participate at a certain level of difficulty, is one of these more advanced than the other, or do they cater to all levels somewhat equally?
Excellent question. Seattle will always be welcome to beginners of all kinds, and even programmers who are not low level whatsoever. They could be web people like Google. They could be they could even be just not programmers at all. Last Seattle conference, we had structural analysts from Boeing, and we had people working on diesel engines coming to this conference, and we had AWS people who don't do low level stuff, and they still got a lot out of Handmade Seattle, and that's intentional, because I'm not saying it's perfect, but I am working towards this system that caters to this split I have noticed in the Handmade Seattle audience. I want to cater to both splits. The split is you have the core audience of Handmade who have, as you know, the Handmade conferences are inspired by Handmade Hero, the series, which is, we're not affiliated with Handmade Hero, but Casey has supported my efforts from the beginning, and he started Handmade Hero, and as you know, that series is all about writing your own video game from scratch and teaching you, but starting from the basics and then teaching you ever increasingly in-depth stuff, right? And a lot of people grew up at this point with Handmade Hero because it's been like, what, 7 years, right? Like they grew up with Handmade Hero. And like they have this mental model that many people outside Handmade don't have about how to program that feels to the outsider kind of hardcore, right? Like, oh, okay, like you can make your own engine now if you want to, right? And if you kind of want to compete with Unreal or Unity by just like making your own in-house engine, you actually are well equipped for that because of how much time you spent not only with Handmade Hero, but just like talking to the people in the Handmade community and all of that stuff. So I'm sorry. So that's like the half of my audience. It's like this core audience, right? But now we have this other half, which is what I call the Handmade curious. And those are the beginners. Those are the structural analysts, or they're not programmers, or they're beginners, and they don't want to know what's going on. I want to cater to them too. And out of what I'm thinking of is doing what I call U-shape design or U-shape curation of the conferences. So I'm trying to solve for this problem of catering to both. And you can't always do it, but you can meet this halfway by doing the U-shape thing. So but what I mean by U-shape is I instruct speakers and I instruct people who present demos at Handmade Seattle to start off with a hook. So they start their talk or their demo with something impressive. You can imagine like if somebody's presenting their software project, so, I got this new like visual library that does some cool audio stuff as well, right? Then I'm gonna just like start right away be showing you about how cool this looks, right? And like get everybody, even the beginners, like excited. Oh my God, you can do this, in a handmade way because you only wrote this software like using 2,000 lines of C code or less, or like how can you get so much bang for the buck? And like, well, that's the power of Handmade, dude. And like, so that's the hook, right? And that's at the beginning of that U shape. It's like you're starting very high level, exciting everybody, and then as the talk progresses, you start going down that U shape, and as you progressively go to the bottom, you're going in depth into how you implemented that software. So you could even have concepts or like Fourier transform analysis and the CMD hammers that you brought up earlier, and any level optimizations of like intrinsics or scheduling instruction overrides for your CPU, even because you think you know better than the compiler optimizer, and or that all of that, right? And then you're probably gonna lose half of that audience when you get to that bottom. But they were so excited already because of the beginning, right? That hopefully they're keeping their attention and like making notes and trying to see if they can learn something new, right? And then the core audience is going to be very excited and understanding everything, right, and learning something new. And then the talk ends hopefully by going back up in that U shape, like ending it back up and like going back to a new hook, an inspirational hook, something that says, you can make this software too, or it's already available, or you can integrate into your library, or like all of that stuff, right? So I'm going to say it's going to be U shapes all the way down for Handmade Seattle. It's not just for the talks, but the demos and like everything I present or have people present is going to be, you start anything new that begins, that it's being shown, will hook everybody in, and then you dive deeper, but then you go back up, which makes sense because even at the end, when I say U-shapes all the way down, like this goes into the structure of even organizing the order of the talks. Because I can imagine I would even end the day of a talk with a talk that's like very high level, like philosophical or fun or about business, because like, everybody's tired at that point. Even the senior hardcore people, at the end of the day, they're tired and they're not going to follow a hardcore context is everything CMD hammer talk of JSON processing, right? So we end the day with like more high level fun stuff. So that's the U-shape also taking place at the higher level of like structuring the schedule, right? So that's what I mean by U-shapes all the way down. Like this is going to be used, this concept is going to be used everywhere, so that beginners always feel that they're starting from a place of excitement. But then as time goes on, hopefully their excitement holds for a while we cater to the hardcore people and they don't feel left alone, right? So that's for Seattle. So to answer your question, finally, beginners should definitely go to Handmade Seattle. And anybody should go to Handmade Seattle. That's the celebration, like I said. Handmade Boston, though, is catering to the core audience. Handmade Boston is catering to the people who, well, at the very least, I'm not gonna set the limit to like you gotta watch all the hundreds of episodes of Handmade Hero. But if you're gonna go to Handmade Boston, you must have at least seen the first 25 to 30 episodes of Handmade Hero. You must be the kind of person who felt comfortable watching the first 25 to 30 episodes of Handmade Hero. You didn't get lost. You worked through the problems in the code base, and like you followed along Casey, you asked the right questions, you got help in the community, and you feel like, okay, I get these topics, I get them. Then you're ready for Handmade Boston. You're welcome with open arms.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a super helpful litmus test for what these two different conferences offer. And it's also another example of what we were talking about earlier, the amount of work that you must be putting into making Handmade Seattle turn out a certain way, to not just pick the right talks, but to order them out and know which ones are going to be high level and which ones are going to be super in depth and all of that. Yeah, that does tie things together pretty nicely from what we were talking about earlier.
And that's a skill that I have to get better at, that I am year by year getting better at, because you can see sometimes in the conference that, like this talk or this demo that was here or this discussion fireside chat that happened, like maybe it felt out of place, or it didn't feel like it fit in very well and all that stuff. But that could just be because it's a bug in my implementation as I was shipping this experience to you, right? Because it is a skill. So just to tell you that I hopefully get better each year at curating the experience such that it just comes across as like, this is an experience that was a narrative that has inspired me and has taught me all these new things with all these themes that I wanted you to learn, right? But I'm still human. It's a skill that I have to learn, and I do get better at it each year. So hopefully you get excited each year with like an even more exciting experience.
I think we're through all the things that I wanted to pick your brain about what you're doing. So if
We're
there's
not going to talk about chocolate wine or Majora's Mask.
Oh, I was going to ask if there was any other things. I guess that I could have known that those were coming up if I was going to. But as just sort of my final thoughts, Abner, about all this is, first of all, you do like clearly just tons and tons of work. The community is in huge debt to everything that you do, and I hope that people realize that there's just so much happening in the community, and not even just our community, but there are other conference organizers who have taken cues from you. You sort of invented the hybrid conference model that's actually working really well, and that other people are figuring out a year behind you. So I think you clearly have a knack for this and are doing a really great job with the ones you've done so far. And
means a lot to me.
Hope that you keep finding success in it. And thanks also for coming and letting me pick your brain about how all this is going. Do you have anything that you want the listeners to know about so that they can follow you and Handmade Cities and things like that?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you for the kind words. It means a lot. And I would like people to just check out handmadecities.com. There's no dash in between. It's just all smushed together. handmadecities.com. Check it out and see who the instructors are, who the speakers are, how the tickets are going to look like, all of that. And there's, like you said, this is a hybrid conference. All the conferences will always be hybrid. Because I also thought about this idea of not only can we make this conference sponsor free, can we also make it accessible for as much people as possible, especially for the little guy, right? So anybody who buys a ticket, you're going to see the prices are much more reasonable than the ones in all these conferences that are backed by corporate sponsors, which is like a weird thing to say, right? Because it sounds like they're like a profit-making monster. Because I am doing just fine. Like I said, it's been about a year that I've been doing this, and I am telling you the truth that so far this looks sustainable, right? But the way to make it sustainable is that people actually are interested and they do buy a ticket. They buy it online or they buy it in person. Don't just think, because we're so niche, right? If somebody had the opportunity to actually attend the conference, because like, oh, I do have the money and all that stuff, but then they choose not to because they think it's going to be, I'm just has enough people. That's a huge opportunity cost if you decide not to do it, right? Because like it does have to be like this tight-knit group of people who want to support the conferences. So if you're thinking like, I could, but I don't know, like, I hope you do. You're going to get a lot out of it, and this is how we make it work. And it's hybrid, so that means anybody can attend online or in person. It also means that, I want to support the little guy. If you don't have the means to attend this conference, we can give you a very good discount. We can even let you in for free if you just tell us your story, if you're just honest. My email is easy to find on the Handmade website there. So send me an email, tell me your story. If you're financially struggling or if you're a student and you want to attend, we try to make it work. And what happens is people know that I do this. So you have also very generous developers who are doing well in their careers who sponsor tickets, for example, or they donate, and then I have a pool of money to just like give away to people in need, right? So I think that's what I wanted to say. It's like, go to handmadecities.com. Yes, it is fully hybrid. You can come in person or online. Look at the ticket prices; they're way better than any of the conferences out there. And if you're still struggling, even with those prices, let me know. Send me an email. We'll give you a huge discount, or you can come for free. We want Handmade to succeed, and that means doing my part to. Yes, I mean to survive as a small business indie person, but I'm not looking to make a huge, again, profit motive like all these other corporations. That's not who I am. So
Awesome. Thanks so much, Abner. It's been lovely talking to you.
woo!